Good afternoon, everybody. We will. Good afternoon, everybody. We are very excited to be able to host a session here today for Reconciliation SA and ALRM. We are we're incredibly pleased to have partnered with ALRM to provide an opportunity to talk about one aspect of race relations here in SA and how this impacts First Nations living here in South Australia. So I might just have to, just a second. Sorry, I had non-muted everybody, so I apologise for that. At Reconciliation SA, our primary role is to provide education, awareness and advocacy. We know that we're not the experts, but we hold a platform and we seek to enable this platform to support a fair, a just and equitable South Australia for First Nations peoples. We are also acutely aware that a great care must be taken to ensure safe, informed discussions can take place, especially when sensitive and life-affecting conversations are held so publicly. We would have loved to have hosted an open forum, and we would have loved to have people with different experiences and different perspectives. This is fundamental in a real and meaningful conversation, and we hope that into the future we can explore this more. But in the current climate and context, it is not possible, and indeed we are hoping that this online panel format will at least be a start to further conversations that enable us to explore and look at how South Australia engages in this very real and important aspect of our society. In the absence of being able to hold such a forum, we have pulled together a conversation with representatives, leaders here in SA. It is at this point I'd like to pass on my apologies for Commissioner Roger Thomas, who was invited to present here today, but is unfortunately able to be here with us. Race relations is an extremely important topic that many people have advocated for many, many, many years, advocating to see change towards a more fair and equitable society for First Nations peoples and people of colour. More recently, we have seen many Black Lives Matter marches that take place across Australia and indeed the world. And this has raised even more higher into the consciousness of everyday Australians the importance of looking deeper into the state of race relations here in Australia and indeed South Australia. This afternoon's discussions come after a very important march here in Adelaide, coordinated by So Black Australia. This is a group that was established in 2014, and it's a people's movement that grew out of a need to address systemic cultural violence against First Nations people. And the SA chapter obviously managed to bring together more than 6,000 people a few weekends ago. I know when talking with Cheryl Axelby at ALRM, we wanted to acknowledge that these recent events have provided a moment in time to unpack as best we can a little bit about what race relations means in our community, and in particular the seemingly differing treatment and processing outcomes of justice and law and order. It's important that this webinar aims to provide an opportunity to hear from a range of experts in their field about how South Australia have responded to the Royal Commission on Deaths in Custody and its recommendations. The areas we know are gaps and what has been done to date to address them. Our aim is to facilitate factual, considered and respectful discussions today to enable South Australia to address some significant areas of concerns across our community. But before I introduce our moderator this afternoon, it is most fitting and right that I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are on tonight, the land of the Kaurna people. I am most privileged to live and work and raise my children here. And as the guest to this country, I offer my respect and sincere thanks for allowing me to do so. I'd also like to acknowledge the many lands that you sit on tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. David Rathman, AM, PSN, FIML, as our moderator today. Mr. Rathman has had a long and distinguished career, both within and outside the public service, across many areas of leadership in Aboriginal affairs, Aboriginal education, employment and family services. Mr. Rathman was awarded the Public Service Medal in 1993 and was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2000. And we've also been awarded the Centenary Medal by the Australian Government. Despite attempting to retire, Mr. Rathman continues to serve on many boards, including being on the board of directors at Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement and committees. We are most fortunate to have that he saw fit to moderate the discussion tonight, and so I'd like to say thank you, David, and once again, over to you.
Thanks, Shannon, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for this very important conversation. I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people and pay respects to their elders and those present and past, and acknowledge their connection to the Adelaide Plains. In addition to that, I'd like to acknowledge all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are tuning into this particular discussion, and say to you, I pay my respects to your people as well. I'd like to also say a welcome to the panel. Cheryl Axelby is the Chief Executive of the ALRM, and also to Commissioner Grant Stevens from the South Australia Police, April Laurie, the South Australian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, Dr. Nikki Vincent, the South Australian Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, and Mr. David Brown, the Chief Executive of the Department of Corrections in South Australia. I'd also say to those of you who are tuning in that the chat function is available for this forum, and we've scheduled some time at the end of the particular discussion that we're going to have for questions to be taken. Please understand that we won't be able to put all the questions to the panel today, but we will pose a few that align with the flow of the conversation. And please be assured all questions asked will be collated by Reconciliation SA and will be done through the work of ALRM to source a response to your particular question. So nothing will be left unanswered. In respect to this particular topic, we need to hark back to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And as an opening comment, before we start, I'd like to go back to the comments of the Royal Commissioner into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, Elliot Johnston QC, who stated in relation to the 99 deaths investigated by the Commission, and he said, no matter what their age at death, they all had files. In many cases, hundreds of pages of observations and moral and social judgments on them and their families. Welfare officers, police, court officials, and countless other white bureaucrats, mostly unknown and rarely seen by the persons concerned, judged and determined their lives. The officials saw all, recorded all, judged all, yet knew nothing about the people whose lives they controlled. So this particular process has been perpetuated right throughout the systemic lack of change within government and its bureaucracies, irrespective of all the effort that's been put in by individuals. So we need to keep in mind the words of Commissioner Johnston. These people that we're talking about tonight are people with families, with connections to their communities. And some of that grieving continues. In respect to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, Creative Spirits has said that in fact, little if nothing has changed. In fact, since the 99 deaths, they estimate a 150% increase in deaths in custody. So tonight, we want to allow our panel to provide us with some insights and comments about how they view progress and where we need to go in the future. We know that the recent events commenced with tragic circumstances in the United States, which has resonated with much of the population here in Australia. The first question to the panel is, do you feel there are differences between the United States movement and the Australian movement? Are there complexities and challenges in Australian context that we all need to sit down and consider in light of the recent events overseas and the lack of progress here in our country? So I'm opening it up to each of the panel members. I might ask Cheryl Axelby, as CEO of the Legal Rights Movement, if she'd like to lead out. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thanks, David. And I also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Kaurna country and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And also say hello to everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening, and also acknowledge my panel members. In the wake of the Royal Commission and the Black Deaths in Custody, I think, when we think about the recent weeks and events of recent weeks, that there's a light that has been shining right across Australia, once again, in regards to the Black Deaths in Custody issue that we face in our own country. And, I have to say that in the context of these recent weeks, there has been advocacy and fighting for justice ever since the Royal Commission recommendations were handed down right across Australia. And we've had many of our elders, past and present, who have really fought very hard to continue to keep the issue on the agenda and fighting for ensuring that the Royal Commission recommendations were fully implemented right across Australia. In the context of where we are now and what's been achieved, I think we've still got quite a long way to go in regards to this. There needs to be acknowledgement of the deaths that have occurred and the loss and grief of families in particular, which I think has always been a bit of an invisible voice throughout this whole journey. And the point that you made, David, is that we're talking about real people's lives here. Those who have passed away in custody, we're talking about numbers now. Like, we're talking about 437 Aboriginal deaths in custody have happened since the Royal Commission. But at the end of the day, these are real people within our families and within our communities. And end of the day, we still not have yet seen justice be achieved, nor accountability for the deaths in custody that occurred. There have been a couple of deaths in custody, or quite a few, that are concerning, and that there should be criminal recriminations, in my view. And there are a number where there's systemic issues that continually contribute through the lack of implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations that still need to be fully achieved. So, my view is that we've still got a long way to go. And also, we also need to address not just the systemic racism, but the direct racism that's continually directed at our communities, and also the racial profiling that continually drives our mob into the justice system.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
No problem there.
Yep.
With
Can you
you,
hear me?
if you'd like, yeah, we can hear you. If you'd like to add something to what Cheryl's already said.
Thank you, David, and panel members. So I'm Merning, I'm Gurgitha. I come from the far west coast of SA. I hail from the Ceduna-Coonamble region, including the Nullarbor. I'm a mother of 3 sons, 21, 18 and 12, and I care for my 1-year-old great niece with Aki, and I absolutely cherish this little girl. But on the 3rd of December, I commenced in the role as Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. So it's about 1.5 years that I've been in the role. So I'm coming with a lens about the Black Lives Matters narrative with respect to Aboriginal children and young people, and how that fits within the scope of, Black deaths in custody, and understanding that my role as Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People is to address the systemic issues impacting on the wellbeing of Aboriginal children and young people across health, education, welfare, justice. Big, remit. I'm co-located with the Commissioner for Children and Young People, Helen Connolly, at 251 Morfett Street. But and I hope by the end of this year that my role, well, the role as Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People as legislated. But, you know, in shaping the focus of my priorities throughout my tenure, I conducted an expansive Aboriginal community engagement process, referred to as community conversations with Aboriginal children and young people, and with Aboriginal families and community members throughout South Australia, you know, metropolitan Adelaide country areas. Putting aside my personal Aboriginal experience with my role, the topic of race relations in South Australia between First Nations people and the wider community, for me, is about the compelling evidence of Aboriginal children and young people's over-representation in care and protection systems, youth detention and youth justice systems. So, you know, when you look at the narrative sitting behind the Black Lives Matters, the impact for me has been around amplifying the failure of the state to change the trajectory for Aboriginal children and young people. And we know that trajectory is about the pathway into the criminal justice system. We know that to be true. We see it in the trends. The whole narrative with Black Lives Matters amplifies, you know, the brutality of the law and justice systems, which continues to lock up children, young children, and mostly they are Aboriginal young children in youth detention. Our narrative amplifies the excessive intervention by the state in the lives of Aboriginal children and their families and communities, but also for me, because of the long-standing increase in, you know, outcomes for Aboriginal children, young people, and the rest of our community across many different social indices, is the lack of accountability of the state in doing anything properly about these matters, despite state and national level inquiries and royal commissions taking place. So the narrative amplifies a whole range of things. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Commissioner. I wonder if Commissioner Stevens, you'd like to make a comment at this stage.
Thank you, David. And I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that we're meeting on the lands of the traditional owners today. And I also pay my respects to elders past and present. The events in the US a few weeks ago with the murder of George Floyd and then the Atlanta shooting more recently, I think horrified everybody who saw that, including my colleagues in law enforcement. Are left scratching our heads as to how culture can develop where the taking of a life can become almost par for the course for a law enforcement response to relatively low-level criminal activity. And it has shone a light on the issue of First Nations people in Australia and the difficulties associated with systemic racism. And I completely understand the focus on the Royal Commission findings and recommendations and the view that not enough has been done to implement those recommendations. I think we're talking about a different dynamic here in Australia compared to what we've seen overseas. And I'm not saying that we're in a better place. And I see it as a positive that those horrific events in the US earlier this month have created momentum, not just in the US, but globally and particularly in Australia, where people have had an opportunity to share their voice and express their concern about the plight of Aboriginal people in Australia and the importance of dealing with those issues that result in young Aboriginal people finding themselves on a trajectory that pushes them in towards the criminal justice system. The challenge for us from a policing point of view is we're probably at the end of that process where we become exposed to some of the criticisms that we've heard about over the last few weeks because of our obligation to intervene when criminal offending becomes apparent. And the goal here needs to be to divert people from the criminal justice system, to stop them getting there in the first place, so that we can provide more opportunities for these people, as opposed to setting them on a pathway that sees them becoming frequent flyers in the criminal justice system. I could also say, from the South Australian perspective, and I can't speak on behalf of David Brown in terms of corrections, but our review of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and the recommendations that relate to policing certainly put me to the position where I'm of the view that we have actually actioned the 82 recommendations that relate to deaths in custody from a police perspective. We've done a significant review, and we've also been independently reviewed, and those actions as they relate to police for South Australia have been implemented, and we maintain a commitment to ensuring that we honour the outcomes of that Royal Commission by adhering to those findings.
How does this shape up in terms of your responsibilities and role in South Australia?
Was that to me, David? I just missed the first part of that.
I was going to Commissioner Vincent.
Oh, sorry.
Nikki, I was just wondering have you got any comments, and how does it shape up in regard to your responsibilities?
Yeah, okay, thank you, David. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on Kaurna land and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the other panel members. My role as the Commissioner for Equal Opportunity is to prevent discrimination and promote equal opportunity in South Australia. We do that I administer the Equal Opportunity Act, and there are 15 grounds under that act, and race discrimination is one of them. It's a massive role and minimal resources, but we have a dedicated team of people that work tirelessly in addressing discrimination across all of those areas. I think you asked, David, initially about this started in America, and why does it resonate in Australia, and are there differences? I think Black Lives Matter was started in the US with that terrible shooting of Trayvon Martin, 17-year-old, by a police officer who then was acquitted. And it was a simple hashtag, and then people began to take to the streets to protest against racism, inequality and violence. And it resonates here because Black Lives Matter here, obviously, and there are so many strong parallels between the triggers in the US and those in Australia. Since white settlement, our First Nations people have endured land seizures, massacres, servitude, and well into the second half of the 20th century, children forcibly removed by government agencies and church missions in the name of racial assimilation, the stolen generations. And although our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, declared there was no slavery last week, he later backtracked to clarify that he meant no legal slavery. So as a direct result of Australia's colonisation and its devastating intergenerational trauma and consequential effects, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are 3% of the population, but 27% of the prison population. Their life expectancy is 8 years less than the national average, and many Aboriginal children and young people do really badly at school. Although I do want to acknowledge, April, in your work, in your consultations recently, the radical optimism that you talked about, which was so brilliant and so heartening to read, and must not be crushed. We must do better to sustain that. There have also been many Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia, and I can only imagine that for those families witnessing the video of George Floyd being killed at the knee of a police officer in the US had unbelievably powerful, triggering and traumatic effects for those who've experienced similar deaths of family members in custody. And the incredible parallel was David Dungay, who also said, "I can't breathe," multiple times, just like George Floyd, as he was killed in his prison cell a few years ago. I think Black Lives Matter in Australia is about recognising that dispossession, persecution and the continued oppression of experienced by First Peoples. And it's also about other people of colour who now call Australia home and are also experiencing disadvantage and racism in our country.
Thank you. David, do you want to add anything to what's been already said so far?
Thank you, David, and thank you to Reconciliation South Australia for the invitation to join this webinar this evening. I also acknowledge we're meeting on Kaurna land, but I also acknowledge that as a correctional services agency, we have facilities and deliver services across the length and breadth of South Australia, interacting with the Aboriginal nations across South Australia. I think I'll just add a couple of key points, David. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that the lives of every single Aboriginal person that is in the custody of the Department for Correctional Services in South Australia matters. And we take our responsibilities for the care and custody of those South Australian Aboriginal community members very, very seriously. For us as an agency and for myself as Chief Executive, the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody are as relevant today as they were when the Commissioner handed down his findings and recommendations in 1991. And every time I go back and review the recommendations, you can still see the enormous insight that the Commission had into the challenges of the criminal justice system here in Australia. If I look to the recent events in the United States and the relevance to those events in Australia, I just wanted to highlight one common feature between the United States and Australia. And that is, as societies, we have a very heavy reliance on incarceration as the most appropriate form of penalty for people who commit offences against the community. And when you look at the adult correctional system in South Australia, like April touched on earlier, for young people in young Aboriginal people in South Australia, for adults in South Australia, Aboriginal people are 13 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous South Australians. And the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the custodial system is a huge social justice issue. And deaths in custody in the custodial system really are a lightning rod for highlighting that social justice impact of overrepresentation.
Thank you. One of the points that's been made by many commentators and observers in the community and those people who've been directly affected by deaths in custody and lengthy custodial sentences is the Royal Commission is still highly relevant today. It's 334 recommendations. And it's interesting that the observation is that South Australia has only implemented about 52% of those recommendations and never maintained a commitment to oversight. So we had the Aboriginal Justice Advisory Committee that went by the by after a time, and we spent about 5 years observing the actions of our agencies. Now, The Guardian, and I don't mind if it's Commissioner Stevens or yourself, David, who responds first, but agencies, it said, agencies such as police, watch houses, prisons and hospitals failed to follow all of their own procedures in 41% of cases where Indigenous people died. How is that sort of positioned here in South Australia in response to that observation?
If I might go first, David. I think it's important to understand just what is included within the definition of a death in custody. The general construct, I think, people's perceptions are that a death in custody is in our watch houses or cell facilities. But the reality is the definition applies to any death of a person where it is in the presence of police. So that could include a vehicle pursuit where the offending driver has a collision and dies whilst being pursued by police. It could include a circumstance where police are, a person runs from a police officer having been asked for particulars or whatever might be the case. It could include a person who takes their own life inside a residential premises when police are knocking on the door. So the definition of a death in custody is very broad. The obligations as they relate to our custodial facilities, I'm quite confident in stating that the recommendations from the Royal Commissions in relation to how we manage our custodial facilities, the training we provide to our people, the services we provide to Aboriginal people who are in our care and custody are being adhered to a very high standard. And I can only speak on the South Australian perspective. I can't speak on behalf of my colleagues in other jurisdictions, but I'm confident that the majority of the recommendations from the Royal Commission as they relate to police custody have been implemented in their entirety, and those which have not, the spirit of that recommendation has been adhered to, and there are circumstances that prevent us from fully implementing those. One example is the requirement for corrections and police to conduct a debrief in relation to circumstances relating to the custody of Aboriginal people where an event occurs. That is often difficult when we have an investigation that is currently afoot in terms of the circumstances relating to that injury or death. So that's just an example of where we haven't been able to fully implement, but we've certainly adhered to the principle as much as we possibly can.
Thank you.
Oh, and can I also say, David, just before I move on, and people may have seen the small piece I provided for the Advertiser about a week ago, where over the last 10 years, we've had 6 Aboriginal people have died in custody according to that definition. The ones that died in police custody, one was as a result of acute diabetes, and another one was a heart condition. The other 4 deaths related to different circumstances outside of a custodial facility, and none of those incidents involved the use of police force in an apprehension concept.
Thank you. David, did you want to comment?
Thanks, David. What I would say is that a lot of work and effort goes into putting in place policies and procedures and training for correctional staff working in South Australia. They are on the front line working with people with very complex needs and underlying health and mental health issues. I would be the first to acknowledge that following critical reviews of deaths in custody, whether they be our own internal reviews or whether they be ultimately the coronial inquest and findings from the coronial inquest, that there are times and occasions when staff compliance with procedures or application of training are not in strict adherence with policies and procedures. I think those reviews that we undertake are very important, both in acknowledging factors associated with the death in custody, but also in identifying systemic opportunities for improvement. What I'd also want to highlight is that in the 20 years following the Royal Commission, so from 1991 when the Commissioner handed down his finding for the 20 years that followed, in South Australia alone there were 21,550 individual episodes of incarceration of Aboriginal South Australians. During that period, there were 5 deaths in custody from natural causes and 10 deaths in custody from unnatural causes. When you look at the last 10 years, so looking backwards from 2020 for 10 years, there were 15,322 episodes of imprisonment in South Australia. So an average of 1,532 episodes per year for the last 5 years. There have been, during that period, 4 deaths in custody from natural causes and 3 deaths in custody from unnatural causes. And I acknowledge Cheryl's point at the beginning of the session that we often in these forums talk about numbers, but I do acknowledge the devastating impact and loss that each and every one of those passings have on the family of the loved one who has passed away. But I think that we invest heavily in improving policies and procedures and training and putting in place additional services and programs that certainly did not exist prior to the Royal Commission, and continue to develop and evolve even today.
To the panel members, can I ask you, have you seen some of the hopes and desires that were expressed throughout the Royal Commission and subsequent inquiries? Have they been realised? Are there gaps, and are there things that we have broken down and failed to deliver upon?
David, I'm happy to respond to that. Look, the reality is that when we're looking at Aboriginal deaths in custody and the full implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations, the issue I think for South Australia is the lack of ongoing commitment since probably the mid-80s, when there was a great investment after the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody of actually having the Aboriginal Watch Committees, the Aboriginal Justice Advocacy Committees, where there was the monitoring and also looking and being involved in the development of policy design in regards to how we can actually make situations better for our people. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that we still have the ongoing legacy of violence that's been perpetrated and racism against our mob since colonisation. And we also have in Australia a blaming mentality of our mob for our own situation, which is a result of past policies, practices and laws, which are still not being addressed. So we still have a system, in my view, and from my experience, being in this area for nearly 30 years, over 30 years, is that we're not still addressing and putting supports in to our communities to self-determine our own programs, our own community development, our own priorities. Because again, those rights and responsibilities are continually taken away from us. Now, and this is something that continually happens. It's this systemic, institutionalised context that we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples need to be fixed, or we need to have decisions made for us. We need to be controlled, in a context. Now, for me, when I listen to and talking about how he feels that the 82 recommendations have been implemented in South Australia, and we talk about the numbers of deaths in custody that have happened either in prison or in the police context, or even external to police custody. What I think is forgotten here is it's not just about how the Royal Commission recommendations were implemented, but it's what actually contributed to that point in time for when that person had died, no matter where they were. And the definition of Aboriginal deaths in custody with their engagement with police is something that I think should never be altered, because it gives the opportunity to unpack as to what led up to the circumstances of that event happening. And these are some of the things that we're still yet to have. I'll talk about the Royal Commission, not just the Royal Commission recommendations, but all the coronial inquests that have been held over the decades. And in South Australia, it'd be really interesting to unpack how many of those recommendations from the coronial inquests have actually been implemented in South Australia. The other aspect of that is also, just from one final note, is when we're talking about other reports. There's been significant reports of recent times, particularly in the last 10 years, and there was also an Australian Law Reform Commission report called Pathways to Justice, which identifies the same issues that are still predominantly outlined in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody recommendations. So I think we need to get real. We need political will, and we need commitment, but we also need all of our areas working together collaboratively so that we actually are ripping off the Band-Aid, I'll call it, and looking at realistically what's actually happening, and not coming from political context and a government context. We need to actually start getting down to the real issues.
In respect to the Royal Commission outcomes, April, one of the glaring examples that's evident is the incarceration of women. Do you think, and that's increasing, Have you noticed in your consultations concerns about the care of children and welfare of those children as those circumstances deteriorate for their mothers?
Commissioner Helen Connolly actually did a big piece of work when I first commenced examining that whole issue about women in prisons and their children, and hearing directly from children whose mothers were incarcerated. And my understanding from that report, there are a multitude of issues impacting on our children, like the whole thing about being separated from your carer, your primary carer being your mother. But what that looks like for Aboriginal children and young people is another compounding aspect to separation from family, separation from your actual mother, which is cognizant of all those things we speak about and hear about, with stories that come from forced removals of policies and practices in the child protection era of today, but also past practices. So the fact is that we have many different ways of policies being implemented, practices that have direct bearing on Aboriginal children and young people's right to family, whether it's about the incarceration of their mothers, whether it's about, the removal due to child protection issues, but the fact we don't engage families, we don't engage the mother and her immediate family about care arrangements for the Aboriginal child or young person. I know there were several recommendations from the Royal Commission pertaining to the rights of children and their access to their mothers while they were incarcerated. I'm not really sure where that's up to. Cheryl, you might want to provide comment there. But for me, that whole experience of the increase of young females into youth justice detention is on the increase. You only have to look at Cavan on a daily basis and see the cohort of 100% Aboriginal young women in Cavan detention facility. So, and that trajectory into the adult prison system is something to be addressed when we're looking at what that means for an Aboriginal young person. Cheryl, sorry, I thought I'd cut you off before.
Did you want to add something, Cheryl?
Just on that point with over incarceration rates for women, fastest growing and highest incarcerated group in the last 10 years. I think it's increased by around about 88%. And that also Aboriginal people in the justice system have increased by 88% over the last 10 years as a whole. So, when we're actually looking at the law and justice context and, law and order, tough on crime approaches, what we're seeing is that some of those changes to, strengthen and have higher penalties is what's driving incarceration rates for our people. And it's also really important, I think, the point that has been made about incarceration of women. We're seeing a lot of our women being criminalised or children being taken away because of their experience with family violence. Now, there is an impact, and we need to look at the impact on children and family violence, but then we also need to look at the impact on family and children or the impact of trauma of continually being removed, and these practices still continually happen despite looking at the whole bigger picture about that mother being a victim. That mother being a victim at that point of when she's getting support and calling for police assistance often results, a lot of times, and this is nationally a well-known statistic, that they're likely to be arrested as well as the perpetrator, because they'll get a warrant check or something done on them, and then they're also taken into custody. Now, these are some of the imparities that we see that of the treatment of our people in the justice system in comparison to mainstream Australia. And these are issues that seriously need to continually to be looked at. And that comes back to training, but that also comes back to, what is it that is a driver where we enter, the justice system, and where discretionary powers are not utilised in comparison to non-Aboriginal people. And that's also a well-known fact and reported fact as well.
Thanks, Cheryl. Nikki Vincent, my question to you is that the breakdown that's occurred over a long period of time, maybe it isn't a breakdown, people are saying that things have been done, but to many Aboriginal people and observers, the change hasn't been as fast or significant as it should be since the Royal Commission. A study completed by the National University, a 10-year study of 11,000 Australians over a decade, has shown that there are, even amongst people who are deemed to be left-wing people, there are heavy signs of negative views towards Aboriginal people. And those who are on the so-called right side of the world display higher levels of bias. In that study, 75% of Australians have some undercurrent of bias or negative views of Aboriginal people. So as a Commissioner of Equal Opportunities, we've got all the legislation in the world, but why hasn't it progressed?
Thanks, Dave, for the question. I acknowledge everything that April and Cheryl have said and absolutely agree 100%. The problem of racism is a problem of hearts and minds. It's an incredibly wicked challenge. Changing people's hearts and minds is extremely difficult, but that is what my role is all about. Racism underpins everything that we've been talking about today. It does a huge amount of damage, not just to our First Nations people and others who suffer it, but to everyone in our community. We are a very culturally diverse country, and about half of us were born overseas, including me, or have parents born overseas. And racism creates a society where people don't trust and respect each other, and that's what's happening here. There was actually a study, excuse me, it was a study of over 800, sorry, I'll take a drink.
I think so.
There was a study of over 800 Australian secondary school students that the Australian Human Rights Commission reported on a few years ago. I think it was 2015. And those young people reported having experienced racism, 800 of them, and it had huge mental health impacts, including sadness, depression, feeling left out, and that was ongoing. They reported headaches, increased heart rate, sweating, trembling and muscle tension. There was a constant fear. They were constantly sort of hyper-vigilant about being attacked. They didn't want to go to school, and they didn't trust anyone apart from their own families. And when these impacts are ongoing, it affects young people's ability to go to school, to learn, to study, to achieve their future goals. And it also impacts their well-being when they're denied equal access to jobs, to services, to education, and their connection to culture is undermined, and that can be passed on down generations. There's also a financial cost for anyone who cares. It's massive. It's 44.9 billion a year, or estimated about 44.9 billion a year in labour market and mental health costs. So it's critical that we address this for all sorts of reasons. But fundamentally, if this was happening to non-Aboriginal people's kids, their families, if those were the impacts that were happening to them, how on earth would they feel? There are no reasons or excuses for racism. Absolutely none. It's ugly, it's ignorant, and it's incredibly destructive. And in many cases, it's against the law. And you can certainly put complaints in if you experience racism, racial discrimination to the Equal Opportunity Commission.
Thank you. Can I go back to David Brown and Commissioner Stevens? Commissioner, you had a report in the Friday, June 19th Advertiser, and it stated, it was done by Elizabeth Henson, that police officers may hesitate when apprehending non-Caucasian suspects for fear of being labelled racist. Is that a real concern for you? And what action is going to be taken to address it?
Thanks, David. Can I just go back one step just to clarify a point Cheryl made? I hope you didn't mistake me. I'm not suggesting the definition for deaths in custody should be changed. I am 100% supportive of keeping it broad like it is, because as Cheryl says, it's important that the lead up circumstances to a death in custody, whether it be in a cell, watch house, or in any other circumstance, all of those preceding circumstances need to be properly investigated. So I just wanted to clarify that I'm not seeking to narrow the definition of a death in custody. The issue around a suggestion of police hesitation came out of a radio interview, and I don't remember the exact question that was asked, but we've seen instances where people are now videoing and uploading to social media activities by police where people are being taken into custody regardless of their cultural background, race. And as I said in my public commentary, when there is an apprehension being undertaken and there is a requirement for the use of force or to restrain a person's liberty, by and large, it's not going to look terribly good, no matter what the circumstances are. The focus on what happened in the US and the actions of police and the criticisms of police are filtering through to South Australia and to other Australian jurisdictions. The risk is, I suppose, that police officers who feel that they have an obligation to execute their duty as a result of having detected an offence may hesitate if there is a possibility that they're going to be branded a racist because they are doing what their duty compels them to do. I'm hopeful that that is not the case and that they act in accordance with our values and with our policies and instructions and within the law. But it was an observation of a possible consequence of this momentum that is focusing on police violence, which one of the phrases and one of the banners we've seen in some of the protest activities, end police violence. And my appeal was that people judge circumstances that they see on social media based on facts rather than jumping to conclusions. And I'm not here to defend unlawful or racist behaviour by anybody, including police, but I certainly was asking that people obtain the facts before they jump to conclusions about the causes or the factors that led up to the use of force, and let the facts speak for themselves. And if the facts show that the police officers acted inappropriately, then they should be held to account for that behaviour.
David Brown, the question of the Royal Commission. Chris Charles wrote a piece about duty of care owed to prisoners in South Australia. He also used an illustration the Royal Commission was concerned about, and that is the question of reasonable force. What's your department done about making sure that there are necessary steps put in place to ensure duty of care occurs? Because I understand under your legislation, you're ultimately responsible. And how have you dealt with the question of reasonable force?
Thanks, David. Look, central to everything we do in the correctional system is our duty of care to the people in our custody. And one of the very significant powers that a correctional officer exercises in our environment, apart from that principal power of deprivation of liberty, is where a decision is taken to use force. We address it it's addressed through legislation in terms of the circumstances in which force can be used. It's addressed in policy and procedure, and it's addressed through our control, restraint and defensive techniques training that all of our correctional officers are required to undertake. And it is also addressed through the active review of critical incidents where force is being used to establish whether in fact the grounds for that use were reasonable, whether they were undertaken in accordance with procedure, and or whether there's any improvements or changes or more strenuous action that needs to be taken.
Thank you. Commissioner Laurie, April, what changes do you think need to occur in the system? And as Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, what's sort of been your experience and what's your perspective on what's needed to bring about some change?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. So I just want to start by saying, you know, as Aboriginal people, we are strong in culture, we're strong in identity. Despite the turbulent history of colonisation, we have got lots to be proud of as Aboriginal people. However, more broadly today, the context and the reality is that the dominant culture existing across many of our Australian and South Australian institutions and governments are representative of a group of people that are completely different to us as Aboriginal people in this country. And so, and Aboriginal people only constitute, I think, Nikki, you said 3%, somewhere between 2 and 3% of the overall population in this country. And notwithstanding, overrepresented in almost every single social indice. And Australian Aboriginal community is economically poor, statistically very young in age profile with high mortality rates and lower life expectancy, on par with many underdeveloped countries and even to some extent some war-ravaged countries. So therefore the notion of being heard and listened to is therefore quite challenging. So we need to rely on mechanisms like Aboriginal voicing bodies, Aboriginal peak bodies, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, the provision of legal powers and agreements, instruments of law and government, including paid officers and advocates that are Aboriginal. Specific legislation and policy dedicated to Aboriginal issues to focus on the unique concerns for Aboriginal people and to ensure we are heard about the dominant culture and its systems and heard above that. So for me, that's that improvement accountability and that cultural accountability. I know they sound like, you know, bodgy government speak, but it's about having mechanisms in place to keep the system accountable and accountable from the experiences and the lived experiences of Aboriginal people. I mean, despite what Aboriginal people have been saying about Aboriginal lives matter, well, the trending in outcomes for Aboriginal children and young people and the rest of our community have been getting worse. The outcomes are getting worse. So Aboriginal people do not hold the power and the leadership at the top where we can get change. We can produce alarming statistics and reports that have all the aforementioned mechanisms to hear the, you know, the Aboriginal voice, and we still need more. And we know this to be true. So, you know, you only have to look at the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody and the 430 plus Aboriginal deaths since that. That's the proof, that's the reality. For me, the catalyst of a protest, a movement, a campaign with the support of our allies, when we are truly heard, are the things that, you know, give rise to international attention to change things. So we can have all those systems in place that engage with Aboriginal people and to hear our voices, and, you know, we can have Aboriginal, you know, everything. But why have things not improved over time when we've had royal commissions and national inquiries? Because that accountability isn't there to actually keep the systems honest to the implementation. And so if over the period of time things have gotten to the stage where we are now, where we're having a Black Lives Matter movement and the protesting and the campaigning to change things, then the narrative is about amplifying the lack of accountability across government. to affect implementation of the recommendations of the Royal Commission and addressing the ongoing Aboriginal deaths, as well as the ongoing overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in child protection, youth justice and out-of-home care. So, you know, there's lots to actually work towards in terms of systems change, but how we elevate the Aboriginal voice and have a voice to Parliament and get recognition in our Constitution are some of the fundamental things that can ensure that Aboriginal influence in the greater, you know, in the greater arena is required.
Thank you. Nikki, Vincent, one of the issues that arises here is the passion of Aboriginal people, the ongoing representation of Aboriginal people to governments, to agencies, people raising their voice out of concern for their fellow countrymen and countrywomen. But what should change from the point of view of non-Aboriginal people?
Well, I think there's a lot that non-Aboriginal people can do. And I hope these things don't sound trite, but I'm going to talk about a few things. And I suppose fundamentally, I think we need to educate ourselves and educate our children, and also recognise the privilege in being able to do that. We should be teaching children, all kids at school, about our First Peoples history from the moment they enter school. And as I understand it, this history is an optional extra in the national curriculum. It's only taught if a teacher decides they want to teach it. There may be some compulsory parts through the national curriculum depending on the year level, but having it as an optional extra is absolutely outrageous, and I think it should be something that happens for every child. And we also need to educate ourselves about how non-Indigenous Australians benefit from Indigenous dispossession and inequality. It's a reality we have to face up to. I think a really good starting point, and I often talk about this for all kinds of discrimination, but racial discrimination is it's a particularly interesting test, is to take the Harvard implicit assumptions test. You can go and find them online, and you can do it privately in the confines of your own home, and you don't have to tell anybody what the results are. But it reveals your unconscious biases towards people who do not have the same skin colour and don't look like you. And I guarantee that many of us, in fact, I would say the large majority of us, as that study that you referenced earlier, David, found, have unconscious bias in relation to people who are different from us, across gender, across disability, across race, and so on. Once you realise that, and because we all have them, it's the most important thing is we can't do anything about the fact that we have them unless we know we have them, unconscious bias, that is. And if we know it, then we can do something about it. So the most important thing is to find out, do we have that? It's unconscious, we don't mean it. And some of us will be shocked to discover that we do have those unconscious biases, but it's something I recommend. I think Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, has done a huge amount to sort of uncover the other story about Indigenous peoples' history. And it's a really good start for adults, I think, as is the Healing Foundation website. And one of the things when I was in a previous role running the Governor's Leadership Foundation program, I forced all of my participants to watch the series First Australians, and it is brilliant. And I think that we have to be brave in starting very difficult conversations, or what might be very difficult conversations, with our family and friends about racism. It's something, it seems like a dirty word, and it is a horrible thing, but we have to face it. We have to puncture that nice view that we have of Australia and face the reality that we do have racism in Australia. I think we can get involved in organisations like Reconciliation SA, Amnesty, the National Justice Project. Sisters Inside is doing a lot to help change things and pay fines of women who've been locked up, Aboriginal women who've been locked up for non-payment of fines, and also donate to the families of people who've died in custody to help them fund legal costs and so forth. And I got harking back to the study that you referenced earlier about 3 in 4 Australians have a racial bias against Aboriginal people. We can listen to and support rappers like Briggs and Birds. Briggs tweeted in reference to that study that the 4th Australian was probably the one conducting the survey. So humour and that radical optimism that April talks about in her report of the attitudes of young people, children and young people, Aboriginal children and young people, need to be supported. And I think, like I did, we can turn up to Black Lives Matter rallies wearing, at the moment, face masks and physically distancing as much as we can. And we can step up and say something when we encounter racism and offer to support the person who's experiencing this. I know they sound like small things, but they are important things that I think non-Indigenous people can do to support our Indigenous brothers and sisters in this incredible dispossession that they've experienced.
Now, to all of you, a question, I don't mind who takes the first step to answer, but what can the allies of Aboriginal people around the country, particularly those people who are viewing this particular discussion, do to support the cause? There's an emotional and very human response, but sometimes we have to get down to dealing with the facts and taking a logical view of where we move in the future. But how can we make our next steps purposeful and meaningful?
I'm happy to have a go at that one.
Cheryl?
I think first of all, there's like this issue is so big and so complex when we talk about the issues impacting our people at all different levels. So, you know, April talked, and I think that's a great starting point, is about looking at the recognition and also looking at how First Nations people are recognised first and foremost in their own country, and also truth-telling about, you know, what has actually happened. So Niki's point about making sure there's education within our schools. But for me, the biggest thing that I would like to see is a total reimagining of the justice system itself, because where we're looking at child protection, the removal of our children, you know, and if we unpack that and we actually look at the intergenerational impact on families and how that is removal of children is actually still an intergenerational impact for many families who actually were impacted by the original past policies and practices. We have to start looking at the system itself and stop looking at and blaming families when a system, in my personal experience, in my view, this is my opinion, continually keeps us dragged into that system. And we don't have self-determination. So, you know, again, the voices, I think, of mainstream Australia out there, just as we've seen with the rallies of late, and where they're being gobsmacked that we've had 437 Aboriginal deaths in custody. These are things that mainstream Australia, you know, have reacted to, and we've seen that time and time again with other significant issues. But we need that to still continue. You know, that fire in the belly that they have, and their voices, to continually challenge politicians, the people in, you know, who make decisions and have power to make decisions for all of us. That needs to happen. We also need more Aboriginal politicians, in my view, at that table, whether it be independents, whatever. You know, it's a hard job being a politician, but I think we need to have more of our own mob And, part of the conversation that's been had in regards to looking at how we address or redress that imbalance of power is about looking at how we actually do have a voice to Parliament. And my personal view again is about we actually do have designated seats provided to First Nations people, because we're only 3% of the population, and we are always challenged, and every policy and practice that is impacted upon us is taken into account from the whole mainstream population. And then because we're only 3%, well, we don't make policies, that will impact so much on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, unless they're punitive, because it really won't make a difference. So my reimagining of the justice system means that we actually unpack and look at, do we need to actually have people who have fines going into the prison system? What are the alternatives? What about our young people who are between the age of 10 and 14? Let's look at raising the age of criminal responsibility so that we give the future generations a fair go going forward, and that we actually look at alternative pathways and rehabilitation rather than the criminogenic colonialism context that we continually have in this country. I don't believe our issues will change until we start seeing investment at the front end rather than building more police stations, building more prisons, and having a accountability context. What we need is community development programs, Aboriginal-led programs run by our communities so that our communities can stand proud and make their decisions, and know what's best to actually turn this issue around for our people.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to comment?
Yeah, David, if I can just briefly, once again, going back to what Cheryl said earlier in this chat, I think genuine collaboration is a very powerful tool, but it has to be genuine, and a willingness for some of the establishments such as police or corrections to engage as proactively as possible with Aboriginal Australians and work together to develop those policies and frameworks that directly impact on Aboriginal people.
Thank you.
David, sorry, if I could just echo Grant's. Last comments, and I'm certainly up for engaging in that policy discussion about reimagining what the criminal justice system can look like, and using my position of responsibility in the South Australian sector to give advice to government, who are ultimately the policy holders in this jurisdiction. I just wanted to touch on a couple of other points, and one is that we need to continue to find those opportunities for Aboriginal South Australians to join the South Australian Public Service and to become active members of the public service, and that is something we as an agency are very committed to. And we do need to look at how we better engage with Aboriginal controlled organisations and give greater capacity and authority for Aboriginal controlled organisations to be part of the response to the challenges we face in the criminal justice sector.
Thanks, David. We've got some questions that people have sent in. We've summarised the points just to keep the numbers down because we haven't got all that much time, but to just summarise what you've said in terms of the way ahead, it would appear that people are saying that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups to be strengthened in their resolve to progress our community's interests, that our community needs to be in a position to negotiate equally at the table with government and its agencies. That seems to be, in essence, what you're saying. And unless that's done, then we're always the receiver, not the group that's joining at the table as equals. Jennifer Duncan sent in a question: what work is being done and what scale of investment is being made within each of these organisations to uncover, and I presume that's directed at the speakers from the agencies that are here today, to uncover and correct bias that might be operating at the individual and systems level within each of these organisations. So I direct that to David and Commissioner Stevens and Commissioner Vincent as to what are you doing about that?
If I just go first, David, we are committed to making sure that the training that our police, firstly, it starts with this recruiting and selection process, and we put people through a psychometric testing process to identify whether they possess the sorts of biases that would make them unsuitable to be a police officer, and that includes their attitude to racism. Once we have the opportunity to develop these people in the academy, cultural competency is a significant proportion of some of the work that they do to understand the relationship between police and the Aboriginal community. We look at the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody findings and what they mean for police. We all regularly update our training. We build cultural competency training into different levels of leadership development. And we are currently going through a process where we are looking at investing significantly in renewing that training and ensuring that all levels of the organisation, all employees, are provided the opportunity and in fact mandated to participate in that. And that goes from the very top of the executive level right through the organisation. And it's not just a one-off exercise where we do this once and then we tick that box and put it away. It's continuing to engage with our people and to ensure that their behaviours reflect the values of the organisation.
Thank you.
David, if I could just add a couple of points. Like police, corrections have very similar processes in place around recruitment, selection, training and cultural awareness. So I won't repeat those areas, but I'll just give a couple of other examples of where I think we are making positive steps. Firstly, we are genuinely committed to increasing the number of Aboriginal people working in the Department for Correctional Services, and that is in particular at the front line. So the work area where Aboriginal people are most employed are as frontline correctional officers, and in terms of raising awareness and building relationships and cultural competence, that has a very positive impact. At our executive level, and I've been in South Australia now for 11 years, and the entire time I've been in South Australia, the most senior Aboriginal officer in the Department for Correctional Services sits on our executive table at all executive meetings and contributes to both the strategic direction, the operational performance and reviewing the operation of the agency. And the final area is building partnerships with Aboriginal community members. So we hold every year an Aboriginal staff forum where all Aboriginal staff are invited to come together for a forum and to discuss their experiences working in the agency and to have direct access to myself and other members of the executive team. And so they're just a few examples of the things that we are working on and always willing to consider other improvements as well.
Thank you. A question now from Amy Rust. I don't know, Nikki, if you wanted to say anything on this.
Thanks, David. I was going to say, well, I've got 7 full-time equivalent people in my organisation, so it's not a big organisation. It's not a big challenge. Make sure everyone goes through cultural awareness training, but people who work in the equal opportunity are kind of hardwired to care about this stuff. We all do go through the cultural awareness training, and we also work very closely with the Aboriginal cultural advisor in the Attorney General's Department. That said, we are absolutely incredibly aware that the experience of everyday racism for many Aboriginal people is not reflected in the number of people who Aboriginal people who put complaints into us. It's very rare. It takes a certain amount of strength and I guess capacity to come forward with a complaint of racism, and it's generally the most overt kind. So we put that to a young lawyer who was an intern for us at the Equal Opportunity Commission. And I see April smiling because we all have such a soft spot for him, and April was consulted for his report. And we asked him to consult with Aboriginal elders and other key stakeholders about how we could improve accessibility of the Equal Opportunity Commission for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, he wrote a fabulous report with a huge number of recommendations, and this is something we all feel pretty passionate about. We have been directed to focus more attention on disability at the current time by the Attorney General, and we are doing that. But we are determined that this report will not go to waste. So watch this space. I'll certainly be advocating for some funding to get out and do the sorts of things that this young lawyer, Aboriginal lawyer, suggested that we do.
Thank you. The next question, and probably Cheryl and April might want to lead out on the response here. Amy Rust has asked, do panellists believe that an adequately funded and legislated custody notification system for Aboriginal adults and youth would make a very positive difference for those who interact with the justice system, or are we doing enough with the current arrangement? Keeping in mind that successive South Australian governments have rejected the concept of a custody notification system being legislated, and the Commonwealth Government has also failed to implement the system at the national level.
In South Australia, there has been an offer made by the federal government to fund a custody notification service, and this has happened in every state and territory by the NIAA, National Indigenous Australians Agency. Unfortunately, the South Australian government have now rejected the proposal twice, despite ALRM supporting the call for custody notification to be legislated. And the importance of having it legislated is that it means that every time an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person is detained by police, that there is a mandated notification that is sent to ALRM, and that there would be, and the other aspect of the mandated notification service is that we would then be able to receive funding to be able to employ lawyers to provide that after hours support to our community members after hours. So it has a great lot of benefits in not only ensuring the safety and well-being of our people in the system, but it also means that they can get immediate legal advice and assistance, which means that we may see less of our mob being remanded in custody, and there might be greater bail options, and then we may also see a lot more of our young people being diverted from the justice system at the point of time that they are arrested, which is a real, again, serious issue in South Australia, where we have such an underrepresentation of our people being diverted away from the justice system. So absolutely, I believe that it will make significant difference for South Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples if we had a system legislated in South Australia. The other aspect of that is also it provides accountability for police in that context of that point of time. And I'm not going to go into any great details about that, but a lot of our mob do report that they have not had their rights afforded to them, either to contact ALRM or in the context of in that context. So it creates not just accountability, but it also creates safety, I think, and more, I suppose, protection for police as well.
Okay, Kelly Treloar.
David, can I just respond?
Yes.
Firstly, I don't seek to make any comment about the funding opportunities for ALRM as a result of a mandated scheme. If that's a positive outcome, I certainly wouldn't refute that. But in terms of the benefit, I think it's worth pointing out that whilst it's not mandated in legislation, there is a mandated requirement within South Australia Police for ALRM or the Aboriginal Visitors Scheme to be contacted on every occasion when an Aboriginal person is taken into custody. And my advice is that invariably happens, and I would question whether or not a legislative framework would increase that level of compliance with that obligation. The merits of the scheme are unquestioned. I fully support it, but I do question whether or not there would be any greater compliance. And if Cheryl has details about occasions when that doesn't happen, I'd be very happy to hear about it, so I would follow up, because I am seriously committed to making sure that officers working in custody suites or taking Aboriginal people into custody comply with that obligation.
Thank you. The issue of people with disabilities has been raised by Kelly Treloar. What action is taken in the criminal justice system to recognise and support those people within the system? Cheryl, you might have some observations about that issue.
What we're seeing is more and more of people with disabilities entering into the justice system and being criminalised for behaviours that sometimes they cannot control. And I think this is becoming a much bigger issue, and we're also seeing a lot more of our people with disabilities becoming homeless as a result as well. So what we're seeing is the withdrawal of services within community and even with government in regards to disability type support services. And this has been happening over many, many years, that we're seeing a greater number of our people incarcerated as a result because of either cognitive impacts, and many are well known within the justice system, and yet are continually charged with criminal offences. So, I think there's not enough being done in the investment of actually supporting people with disabilities. The NDIS now has been introduced, and now we've seen a pullback of services services like Disability SA. And we need a greater investment is basically what I'm saying that we need in South Australia, to divert people with disabilities away from the justice system. The justice system is not a place for people with disabilities.
Well, we're right on 5:30. I apologise to people I haven't been able to get to your questions, but those questions, as I said before, will be answered in time as regard to each member of our panel providing some feedback, and I hope they're okay about doing that if Reconciliation SA directs a question to your organisation so that we can provide a response to the questioners. I'd like to express my appreciation to Cheryl Axelby, the CE of ALRM, to Grant Stevens, the Commissioner of South Australia Police, to April Laurie, the South Australian Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, to Dr. Nikki Vincent, the South Australian Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, Mr. David Brown, the CE of the Department of Corrections, and all of those people that have tuned into this session, and there are many. We do appreciate your interest, and we thank the people that have provided input prior to this session to guide the conversation. Reconciliation SA and ALRM have been part of this discussion. They've partnered to provide this very important opportunity to talk about just one aspect of this journey that we all have to go on. But I would conclude by just repeating the words of Royal Commissioner Johnston when he said that the officials saw all, recorded all, judged all, yet knew nothing about the people whose lives they controlled. We must reverse that journey and become a united force to overcome this injustice. So on behalf of ALRM and Reconciliation SA, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.